everybody, you are listening to Canary Cry Radio, and my name's Basil.
And this is Gons. Welcome to an episode of Canary Cry Radio, which we're just so out of shape in doing because all we do is Canary Cry News Talk now, and we've just lost our Canary Cry Radio rhythm. But this is episode 157. Gons. I know, which, by the way, we're doing live video of this as well. Basil, you're greened out again. You're going to have to undo your video and redo it again. I don't know what my video card is doing, but it's just not really working out. There you go. There's Basil. For those of you watching, thank you guys for being here. Those of you who are here live for this episode, we have returning guest, Dr. Judd Burton. He was a guest on episode 99 of Canary Cry Radio. And he's a PhD. He's an Institute of Biblical Anthropology director and senior fellow. And he's done a ton of work on biblical anthropology. And we're just so excited to have you back. You messaged me, Dr. Burton, about a week ago, and you said you have some breakthroughs, some things you wanted to share. So we eagerly got on the calendar there and tried to get you on as soon as possible. Welcome back. Good to see you. How you doing?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Pretty good.
Just surviving the end of the world, just like everybody else. And making sure to to broadcast 3 times a week. Like, we're practicing for our post-apocalyptic ham radio distress show we're going to be doing.
Right. You'll be broadcasting to everybody who's outside of Free America.
Yeah, exactly. If you can hear this, you're one of the lucky few who have survived.
That's right.
We just know we are out here.
Having visions of Red Dawn.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I was reminded that you were back on episode 99, which was, that's a good spot. You got in at a good spot. That was right before our 100th episode that was 8 hours long. We had done a Halloween themed show talking about vampires and werewolves and everything in between. And it was just such a valuable conversation. I think a lot of people consider it one of the classic Canary Cry Radio episodes. But today we're excited to have you here because you have something new out here. And if you don't mind, I would love to read through some of this language about the War of the Words, Gods, Kings, and Their Titles, a preliminary report on a linguistic relationship between the REPHAIM and royal titles in Eurasian languages. And the description goes like this. The God Kings presided over prehistoric and antique civilizations, ruling with iron fists. When the age of the first such kings faded, the idea of the deified king was passed on to the rulers of men. The oldest of these God Kings in the historical record were the REPHAIM, the feared tribe of giants in the ancient Near East. The Mesopotamians and Phoenicians called them kings and princes of the abyss, and their name became synonymous with the concept of the autocratic king. Unravel the mystery of how this word began as a corruption of an ideal, how it survived, and then spread to the languages of Europe, Asia, and beyond in this preliminary linguistic assessment from the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. I gotta say, this is probably the most fascinating paragraph I've ever read.
No doubt, huh?
Yeah,
and
you're really doing the good work.
And before we toss it to you, I want to go ahead and do this because I think this whole episode is just one giant Nephilim update. Nephilim update. Nephilim update. Nephilim update.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah,
I can't believe it took us so long to have you back on the show.
Yeah,
I know. We're gonna have to remedy that.
Yeah, you can come back as many times as you'd like, but yeah, go ahead, Basil.
So why don't you start? Tell us, what does all that wonderful stuff mean?
Well, for you, I mean, a lot of your listeners will be familiar with my work, and I sort of tread the same waters that mutual acquaintances of ours do. People like the Gilberts and Dr. Heiser, and I always, what I wanted to do initially, particularly when I wrote Interview with the Giant, was to apply anthropological models to the study of the ancient giants. And so I'm basically continuing that track. I'm always thinking about that because that's really how I'm oriented as a historian and an anthropologist. And you're probably expecting some story about the genesis of this project. I'm in my office and surrounded by piles of books and papers and manuscripts and just a scholar's mess. But in reality, it was about a week ago that I woke up in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and for some reason, I was thinking about being back in the lecture hall teaching my students in world civilization. And one of the things that I used to do to illustrate the spread of languages was a little exercise, in particular Indo-European languages, since we were talking about the old world, the ancient world and the medieval worlds. And so one of the, you can do this little linguistic trick where you can show the relationship between structurally similar words. In other words, they have similar component parts, the smallest component parts being what linguists call morphemes. And they typically have phonetic similarity and certainly idiomatic similarity. That's what linguists call a cognate, a shared idea. And so when the word, interestingly enough, that I used to use was king, the word for king, that spread from the Indo-European heartland that scholars and linguists and anthropologists position somewhere between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Well, when waves of people began to migrate from this region, one of them migrated into the Indian subcontinent, and their language became Sanskrit, which was the ancient language of India. And in Sanskrit, king is Rajan. Well, another group broke off and ended up in the Italian peninsula and eventually became the Romans. And the language that they spoke, of course, was Latin. In Latin, the word for king is rex. And you have other languages that branched off of that, such as Spanish and French. In Spanish, king is rey. In French, it's roi. And so on and so forth. So you can see the structural similarities in these words that shared common origin. And it's not uncommon to find these core words that deal with kinship, that deal with political roles, that deal with religious roles, that deal with gender, that deal with space, that deal with time, these very core words. It's not uncommon to find these similarities in structure and pronunciation in the languages of Europe and Asia, because they as linguists posit, come from a distant language or family of languages called Proto-Indo-European. And so I'm staring at the ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning, wondering, okay, God, are you trying to tell me something? Because at that point, I'm starting to connect dots with what I've seen done by scholars like Dr. Heiser, by Derek and Sharon Gilbert in their book Veneration, by an Estonian Assyriologist named Amar Anus, who's done a lot of good work connecting the Watchers and the Giants to the Mesopotamian world. And I thought of Rephaim and that cognate that or not cognate, excuse me, morpheme, that small portion of the word, the RE portion or the REP portion. And the studies that had been done comparing that word Rephaim, which of course students of the Bible will know is one of the tribes of giants, comparing that word to similar words in ancient Near Eastern languages, such as Rop or Rapi that you find in Akkadian, and probably Sumerian at one point, since the Akkadians borrowed a lot of words from the Sumerians. That word is used as a designation for a prince, and the last portion of it, the AP or the AB, is a reference to the abyss, the underworld, and so there's not only a secular designation, but there's also this supernatural designation that these were the long dead kings that deserve veneration in the underworld. And likewise, you really get this fleshed out in greater detail in the Ugaritic literature. It's really fascinating, and this word also occurs there as Rop and Rapi, which is a designation for the long dead ancestor kings that have to be venerated and placated. And so these particular texts are accompanied with all kinds of spells and incantations for that purpose. And when you begin to consider the context of the Hebrew word, the Hebrew translation of Rephaim as dead ones or wraiths or shades, and their association with Sheol, in the Old Testament, it becomes a matter of interest not only in terms of supernaturalism, but also linguistically and culturally, because the implication here is that these were the first god kings, sort of following up on what the Watchers and the Nephilim did as autocratic usurpers. In the pre-flood world, you have that tradition continued by arguably the oldest strain of giants, the Rephaim, in the post-flood world, who literally were kings amongst the antique civilizations, and then they passed that torch along to the human kings. And again, virtually all early civilizations were theocratic monarchies, where these absolutist tyrants ruled over their city-states and civilizations. More often than not, those rulers believing that they were gods or emissaries of the gods on the earth. An example of that, of course, is the Egyptian pharaoh. The pharaohs, particularly in the Old Kingdom, believed that they were incarnations of the god Ra. And that's true on this side of the planet too. The Mayan kings, the Mayan city-states, believed something very similar. And so this idea of the god kings associated with the Rephaim is made pretty clear, not only in our sort of circles, but also in at least in scholastic circles, in terms of its cultural value. But I'm sort of piecing this together and making some notes on my phone, set it down, decide to finish off the night with some sleep, and hit the project with a fresh set of eyes the next day. And this is a little too much to wrap your head around at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I do that, and I begin to wonder the next day, because the Proto-Indo-European heartland that I described a moment ago between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the lower end of that reaches into eastern Turkey and what would have been, eventually have been, northern Mesopotamia. So cultural diffusion is it's a given. It's an invariant in the study of culture. You're going to have different peoples sharing words and borrowing words and repackaging words, and often their structure and pronunciation is retained to a degree. And also, when you consider that the ancient Sumerians, who were arguably the mother culture of ancient Mesopotamia, were not indigenous to the ancient Near East. They actually came from the Indo-European heartland. And if that's the case, then this word that occurs in Mesopotamian languages that's similar to Rapi in the Phoenician material and Rephaim in the Hebrew material, then that speaks to the antiquity of, the age of not only this concept, but the word itself, going back millennia before the ancient Near Eastern civilizations were even formed, because obviously there's exchange going on, but cultural exchange going on between this Proto-Indo-European world and the proximate, what some scholars call the Proto-Semitic world in the ancient Near East. And so I thought, how many? I just wonder if I did a cursory survey, how many of these words in Eurasian languages that mean king or ruler and might bear some structural similarity. How many of these can I find? With this, the important thing being that initial R vowel sound, whatever the vowel was following the R, and the idiom being king or ruler. And I came up with a list that I'm still compiling that's about 70 words, 80 words long.
Wow.
The implication being that the Rephaim initially the Watchers came up with this concept. They took the concept of the perfect sovereign of the created universe, Yahweh, the just and loving sovereign, and just like the demonic realm does, they took it and turned it on its head. And got this terrible parody of, instead of the just ruler, you have the autocratic, absolutist, tyrannical ruler deifying themselves. And words carry culture and history. Words are culture, and they travel and change because languages are not static entities. But my suspicion, my hypothesis at this stage in the research is that this was a deliberate manipulation of language, and even throughout the millennia and even into modernity, this idea of the absolutist monarch, the absolutist king, has been carried into our usage, our language usage, even if it's not purely a cognate that's structurally similar. The idea is still there of this absolutist king. You only have to think about the rulers of city-states, kings and queens of nation-states in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. These people still believed that they were divinely appointed to rule over their populations, and not always with their best interest at heart either. And even into the modern age, any number of fascist regimes and communist leaders propagandize themselves as the same thing. They're gods to their people. That was true of Hitler. It was true of Mussolini, who gave all these speeches in the Colosseum, and tried to trump up the Roman, use the Roman history of Italy to his benefit. Hirohito did the same thing in Japan. Stalin, Castro, even in our, Kim Jong-un, you read about survivors of the North Korean regime. He portrays himself and is portrayed as that, as a deified leader. And so this is a long-standing idea, and I believe that's not completely due to the natural flow and development of languages over time and space. I think there's some evidence here to suggest that there's something nefarious at work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, the connection between, like you're saying, the sort of early God King concept. And you would think in 2021 now, in this age of modernity, that would be such a, I don't know, such a silly way for human civilization to structure itself. But from what I hear you explaining, it's not simply that it's silly and old-fashioned, but that it seems to be almost a built-in, almost sabotage of of structuring human society, which I do want to get into. But you mentioned the sort of straightforward examples of the absolute ruler that even stretches into modern day. And you would think, the idea being that, in America, we don't, we have a president and his hands are tied in many ways. And but as we've seen over the past couple of years, it's almost a built-in aspect of what I would consider maybe people who could use a little bit more thoughtfulness in the way that they view the world, that the president still is sort of this God King type figure and can fix things and destroy things at will. When at least American democracy was a very intentional, at least attempt at not allowing that to happen, but there's certainly different aspects and way that has and has not happened over the history of America. But even considering the apotheosis of George Washington and the sort of occult connections to an eternal godlike entity, that once you're president, you have sort of ascended into this next realm of, whatever. So, and it's so funny because you've heard it explained by different, I don't know, whether they're sociologists or anthropologists or different ologists, that this sort of elevation of leaders might be a natural genetic sort of leaning that humans might have. But I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, the previous structuring of language has sort of predisposed us to elevating leaders in this way, and that, as we've seen, could be definitely used as a means of control and perhaps even more sinister versions of that. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, again, language is, like I say, it's ideas, it's culture, it's
like a world-building technology almost.
It is, and it's sort of, you could think of this as sort of cultural engineering, because I mean, again, if you look at the entire Mount Hermon episode, what the Watchers were doing was just that. They were doing that. It was a cultural engineering. They were, for their own ends, they were manipulating and meddling in the affairs of humanity, the creation of Yahweh. And by doing that, by building these ideas into language, it gives them a permanence, a sort of cementing, into the sort of cultural toolkits that are passed along from one generation to the next. So that, on the surface, it may, and I'm not denying the natural development of language at all. But I'm saying that there do seem to be some cases where, this sort of cultural engineering, supernatural cultural engineering, is the culprit. And I think that these words for king and ruler that I've taken under examination demonstrate that, particularly when you tie them back to the Rephaim. But, as a footnote to this, our society, our political structure is somewhat anomalous in the history of the world, republics that are based on, admitting that every government is basically a necessary evil. There's no perfect government, but a democratic republic such as the one that we have is the glaring exception to the rule. For most of human history, it's been the other thing. It's been the haves and the have-nots, and that's based on this sort of autocratic rule, this monarchy that I'm talking about here, that is, again, firmly ensconced in the words that are used, or at least many words that are used for ruler or king. And even in the context of the United States, you mentioned the painting about the apotheosis of George Washington, which I think he probably eschewed. You have a lot of artists and people like that who are sort of building this up around him, the American pantheon or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a kind of civil religion in America, and there was a really good book written by a historian named Robert Bella of the same name, Civil Religion, in which he pointed out that we don't always acknowledge that those components are there, but there is this kind of unspoken civil religion that's based around our political system. And that also seems to be a kind of natural epiphenomenon of not just republics, but even more so in the monarchies that have littered the globe since the beginning of civilization.
Yeah. You talk about the civil religion just recently with the Capitol protests and the whole thing that stemmed off that. You suddenly heard all these news anchors and very concerned people talking about how these protesters have defiled the sacred temple of democracy and things like that. And, these are generally people who present themselves as secularists and things like that. And the types that would be eschewing, of course, there's all this language now around, religious people being extremists and dangerous. But at the same time, they're deploying religious language around this this structure where in every other aspect of their lives they would consider themselves to be humanist or secularist, but suddenly there's this air of religiosity around civil structures like the Capitol building.
Well, that is the convenience of indoctrination and cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. Well, and what you're saying about the concept of language constructing worldview, or I don't know if I have any fancier ways of putting it. It's interesting how language usually comes from the top down, as we've also seen in the past year. Language and definitions of words are changing almost immediately as it serves the power structure. Rarely do you find correct language that empowers those who are being reigned over. It almost always empowers the will of the leadership, which I think goes a long way to strengthen the idea that you're talking about, which is, well, if human leadership can influence language to control populations, how much more then could some spiritual hierarchy use language as a technology for subjugation? Right.
And, it's interesting that you put it that way, because thinking about it within those parameters, sort of in an Arthur C. Clarke sort of childhood's end sort of way, blurs the line between what is magic and what is technology.
Totally. Wow.
Which anthropologists have been talking about for almost 200 years now. Examining peoples that lived in non-literate societies, where mythology was still at the center, of their culture, they were still geared towards thinking along those lines. So that, and there's a kind of truth in that, when you consider, not veering too far off topic, but when you consider that we live in the quantum age, and multidimensionality is not just scratches on a chalkboard or a whiteboard right now, but it's taken on the hues of reality with things like our super colliders and quantum computing. I mean, using qubits to dump your computing algorithms into another dimension, so that your answer comes back from another dimension. There's no line between magic and science at that point.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly enough as well, using that same, to compare it to the Arthur C. Clarke quote, similarly, adequately constructed language can almost take the place or be indistinguishable from magic as well. We know how important. The Bible talks over and over again about the power that the tongue has, and even the Word of God is described as a sword of the Spirit. Yeah, right. And
alternatively, we know how important words are in high thaumaturgy, high magic, and the occult.
Wow, this is fun. I'm having fun with you.
Yeah, me too.
Language as social engineering technology. And a lot of what you've outlined in context to what happened at the Tower of Babel just fits in like a glove, it seems. The confusion of languages.
Right.
And God's purpose in doing that. Can you sort of rant on how that fits into the thesis?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you bring up the Tower of Babel, because if we're looking at the Tower of Babel event, which obviously was much more than a ziggurat.
Yeah.
If we're looking at that event, and the people that perpetrated it, then, and you begin to consider that if we can reconstruct these languages like Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic, then and there are share words between them, then there was probably an older family of languages with multiple dialects that were mutually intelligible. Well, that translates pretty well into a language that everybody spoke. And you can line that up pretty quickly with the Genesis account. And if that's the case, then these migrations away from the Indo-European heartland, and the language shift that occurs because of that, also lines up, is also pretty congruent with the description of the confusion of languages in Genesis.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about that is you still have these nuggets of similarity in terms of pronunciation and cognates and morphemes throughout the languages that spread into Europe and Asia and the rest of the world. It's a kind of mathematics, but it's a logical argument, based on the kind of work that's been done to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic. The Tower of Babel event begins to take on the hue of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up bilingual. I'm still bilingual. I have a hard time remembering my Japanese kanji and all that. I'm curious if you had Japanese on the list that you have so far. I just did a little armchair digging around, and I remember the kanji for king, which for those of you watching, it's on the screen there. It's 3 lines that go across with 1 line that goes through it. And the understanding here is that It literally means mediator between heaven and earth. So the two lines at the top mean heaven, and then there's a line that goes down to the earth. Like that's what the kanji for king is. And the word is ol or osama. And of course, in Arabic, Osama means like Osama bin Laden means lion. You know, so there's like all these connections that it just in my brain I'm going, whoa, that's pretty crazy. But yeah, the kanji in Japanese and the Chinese language linguistically seem to have a lot of this reference to the ancient languages as well.
Certainly, yeah. I didn't see anything phonetically similar, but I mean the idiom, of course, there is preserved in Japanese. I think I just lost my lighting. I'm not sure if my breaker went through. Can you guys still see me?
Yeah.
You look great.
Okay, great. Good deal. But yeah, as I say, my survey of these Eurasian words continues. I've only scraped the surface. That's why that's why I called this a preliminary report, because that's very much what it is. But I'm astounded just from the sampling that I've taken so far. I did look at some words in other East and Southeast Asian languages, and we can delve into all the examples that I dug up as we go along today.
Yeah, I think that'd be fascinating.
Yeah, definitely want to check out some of that stuff. What was the most compelling out of the ones that you dug into out of the, I think you said 70 so far?
Yeah, well, they were all compelling in one way or another. What I found really interesting again is this R vowel morpheme that recurred in words for king or ruler, that I demonstrated, briefly at the beginning of the show with words like Raj and Rex and Ray. But it recurs over and over and over again. You may have different, endings, different consonant endings, but that morpheme and that cognate, that idiom, it's just amazing. Now, you don't even have to go very far forward outside of the ancient world to begin to run into this. And in Linear A Greek, for example, which was the language that the Minoans spoke, and we know most of what we know about it because of the work of Michael Ventris, who was linguistics was his hobby, and he had basically almost cracked the Linear A code. At any rate, we actually have a recounting on, I believe it's the Phaistos disc, of the story of King Minos that many listeners will be familiar with from the myth of the Minotaur. But his name is actually mentioned on this disc, and the rendering in Linear A is Ruja Mina. So there again is that element, not just the cognate, but the initial morpheme of the R and the vowel, and a word meaning king. Hittite, which used a lot of borrowed words from Mesopotamian languages. You also see a fair number of occurrences of Rabbah as ruler or king or prince. So even within the areas that are proximate to the ancient Near East, you can begin to see the similarity in the spread of these words and ideas. But even beyond the bounds of the ancient Near East and the Proto-Indo-European homeland, you also have, for instance, in the Gothic languages, the languages that were spoken by the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Alans and Sarmatians, the word for king was rex. In the Gaelic tongues spoken in the British Isles, there's some interesting words for king as well. In Irish Gaelic, the word is ri. It's basically the same thing in Scottish Gaelic. The Manx word, which is another Celtic word, or a Celtic language rather, the title for king is also Ri. And in Welsh, it's Brenin. So there, within the cluster of the British Isles, you have this, the survival of this idea. But you ask which ones were the most compelling. Well, the short answer to that is yes, they were all compelling because of the recurrence of these characteristics within words for king or ruler.
Now, is there is there sort of a proto-significance to this particular phonetic theme that you're finding throughout these things? Is there what's the significance of the continuation of this line phonetically?
Well, the significance is both in its origin and in its implementation. If those origins go back to the Rephaim, the dead ancestor kings of the ancient world, the god kings, then you've got a demonic component here, and you have the engineering of these words was such that you could almost think of it as a this is kind of a spellcraft, like we were talking about earlier, because this is a long-lived concept that is so firmly built into it that you really, you almost don't see it. It's almost like it's veiled. It's so innocuous because we use it in everyday language, and we retain the words on a kind of superficial level, and it takes some digging to find out that if there's anything that might be on one level supernatural and on another level perhaps supernaturally malicious.
Right. Yeah. And as we know from studies of the occult, repetition and attention are what gives certain, like you mentioned, spellcraft power or effect. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's almost like the repetition of that phonetic theme throughout the ages has almost an incantational quality to it, or a submission to the power behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Now, I'm trying to think of an English, the English reference to that. Have you identified that?
What do you mean by the English reference to?
Well, you meant, we're talking Ra and Rex and things like that, referring to a king.
The word in English is related to words that you find in Scandinavian tongues, like Danish and Swedish. It appears as Koenig.
Right.
You have to remember that while the indigenous peoples of the British Isles were Celtic, in the beginning in the 5th century, the British Isles were they were invaded by successive waves of Saxons and Angles, and that's where we get Anglo-Saxon from. And so that became that changed a lot of language in England, and it became the dominant. By the time you get to the time of Alfred in the 10th century AD, that's the predominant language in most of the main political centers because of this essentially Viking influence. The later part of it is Danes largely, but English is not Latinized. You don't begin to get words from Latin and Romance languages until after the Norman conquest in the 11th century AD.
And referring back to the incantational quality of it, if you're looking for, if one would be looking for a modern spiritual connection to in a spiritually practical sense, I mean, we're talking about principalities and powers that we know do still in some way reign over geographical regions, much like the kings that we would think of in the human world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think I got to change my name to.
Now, is there sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just wondering if the, as you kind of mentioned, the flipperoo or sort of a misleading purpose for basically to sort of usurp the idea of the word for king, reference to God, and then trying to, I guess, not just humanize it, but sort of misdirect that word. Is it the case that you wouldn't go as far as to say that every case of the word being used is a deliberate sort of misdirection, would you? I mean, because I'm trying to think like,
No.
Okay, King James Bible, is he like Rephaim
Right.
James,
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. There's an element of the natural development of languages here, but there's also, I guess you could think of it as sort of evidence of tampering. In other words, I think you guys mentioned sabotage, a minute ago. You could sort of think of it like that. But yeah, I'm not saying that every time we use the word king or royal or regal or anything like that, that it's necessarily overtly malicious. But again, when just if you're just taking it down to statistics, the approach that historians used to call kleiometrics, where you're using statistical analysis to look at historical models, with the overabundance of autocracies and tyrannical monarchies, and the association of the heads of those states with this word, with this idea, it becomes clear that the deeper implications are malicious and nefarious and do speak to this sort of supernatural cultural engineering that took place with the origin of the word and concept itself.
And when you talk about, I think you might have touched on it before when I brought up the Tower of Babel, but the language that existed prior, is there any clue as to what that was or what it sounded like? Is there any evidence?
The simple answer is no. But what I'm proposing is that it's possible through a kind of comparative reverse engineering, which is how linguists came about with the idea of Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic. When you compare those two languages, it would seem like you could also kind of reverse engineer from those two, perhaps a single language, proto-language that they shared similar origins from or common origins from. And at that point, to me, at least in a way that sort of makes sense linguistically, you're getting closer to a language that proportionately more people on the earth spoke.
Right. Yeah, because I've often heard people claim that Hebrew was the original language, and that's not, from as far as you're concerned, that's not necessarily the case.
It's not necessarily the case, and it's it doesn't obviously it doesn't mean that there aren't cognates and morphemes in Hebrew. that are shared with other ancient languages. That we pointed out at the beginning of the program, the Mesopotamian material, the Ugaritic material. But as for the original language, I don't know that I could completely rule it out, because I can't build a time machine and go back there and find out. But no, it seems that it's a more complex matter than diluting is probably not the right word, but reducing it down to one language as the model, because I think you have a harder time linguistically making a case for that if you try and make Hebrew the original mother language.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting, because these are things that I don't really think about until you bring them up. Then I kind of reach back into
what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
So is there a, not that there must be, but what is the practical adjustment, whether it be not just in action or lifestyle, but more mindset and understanding to a normal listener of ours, or maybe who may read the book, to take away from this? And is there some sort of empowerment that comes with this understanding? Can it be a seed for future development, whether it's sort of cognitive or spiritual understanding moving forward? What would be the focus if someone was bringing a benefit in a practical sense?
Well, again, if we're looking at this, through the lens of the Bible, for people who are believers and subscribe to a biblical supernatural worldview, this is more insight. Not only into the antediluvian world, but in particular, those first few steps that human society took after the flood. When you begin to see, basically the reboot, after the, the sort of dark age that passes, with the flood. Because it's clear, archaeologically, it's beyond demonstration that there were civilizations that were here, that were city-states that were here before the Noahic cataclysm, which I think was the same cataclysm as the late Pleistocene Younger Dryas event.
Yeah.
So what you've got here is that's why I kind of described it as supernatural intel. You've got an insight into, it's another piece of the character makeup of these kinds of entities. It's a continuation of the tradition of the Watchers and the Nephilim, and you have that being continued on in the post-flood world by the Rephaim. This manipulation of human culture for their own ends. And that definitely seems to be the case, because to my eyes, when I take the anthropological linguistic route and marry it with the biblical approach, what appears to me is that this is a malicious, an example of malicious linguistic cultural engineering.
Yeah.
And the fact that this concept and the profusion of occurrences of this word in its form and function exist even to this day should give us a minute of pause at the very least, in what other elements are there in culture that were tampered with by the Watchers, by the giants, that we're just now beginning to understand.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And does it Do you think the reason why God is called King of Kings, is there something that you think maybe God sort of some pre-knowledge of this type of manipulation, that he would emphasize these ideas so much in the Bible, even in the New Testament? Because I'm looking at the word kings. I just did a quick search. It doesn't pop up till Genesis 14. And then Genesis 14 is all kings everywhere, kings of Shinar, kings of... Sure. There's just all kinds of kings everywhere all of a sudden.
And that's also the first reference to the Rephaim, by the way.
Right. So I just find it fascinating that there's that idea of... it's similar to the Baal or the Cloud Rider type of situation where you have Baal, he's the Cloud Rider, but then God, Yahweh, sort of claims that he's the true, I can't remember if it was exactly Cloud Rider, but he basically, I forgot the name. This is why I'm not a scholar. I don't remember the linguistic technique that the Old Testament uses to basically supplant some of those ancient Babylonic titles and stuff, and reassigns it to Yahweh. Is that something similar going on here with the King of Kings idea?
Yes, I think very much so. And it echoes, for instance, the Mount Hermon event too, in the ministry of Jesus. Many people will be familiar with my work on Banias, which is Caesarea Philippi at the foot of Mount Hermon. When he goes there, he's not just firing a shot across the bow, but even in the phraseology that he's using, what does he call the church? He calls them the ecclesia, the assembly, which is doesn't just harken back to the Athenian assembly or the boule, but it also harkens back to, this mockery of the divine council and the assembly of the Olympian gods. And Jesus is basically saying, look, you guys screwed up royally. I'm replacing this false assembly with my assembly. He retakes titles, back like the sons of God that were corrupted in the pre-flood world. So yeah, the way that language is structured in the Old Testament of King of Kings, yeah, it's very much a clarification of what that role originally was, and that the only thing that the demonic realm can do is take what is pure and good that Yahweh creates and then corrupts it. They can't really create anything the way that Yahweh does. And so, that's kind of the story of redemption too, is the restoration of all things. And you ask, is God sort of looking down the pipe, by using this kind of language? Well, yeah, clearly he is, because there's no past or future for God. Everything is the present. He's eternal, so he sees the scope of everything.
Yeah. That's really fascinating to me. I mean, that's always the part that gets me all goosebumpy, is just knowing that there is from our perspective, there's a timeline with the Bible and events that happened and just the order of things. But from God's perspective, it's all just one big thing. And so, of course, he can weave in truths that will come to blossom, knowledge increase, in the latter days and stuff. I feel like we're living in that time where, just as Jesus said, as in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. It seems like he meant more than just, because we've outlined the various things about the Nephilim and genetic tampering, and those are topics that we keep an eye on pretty closely, but also linguistically, something that we've noticed over the last few years is the technology kind of bringing the languages back together, bringing down the language barriers with ones and zeros, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it is very, it's just it's profound to me how these types of, everything from us looking at news stories about genetic manipulation in labs and stuff, to scholars as yourself digging into the ancient linguistic connections, are all kind of coming to the same conclusion that the Bible is true and all this stuff that
right.
people that are very educated will dismiss so easily. But I don't know, it's hard to dismiss when you're coming at it from the perspective you are, where it's scholarly. It's not like you're just making stuff up, unless you ate something that you're not telling us about that night that you were up at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling there. But
no, I think I had a sandwich for dinner. It was pretty plain.
Yeah. So that to me is fascinating, and I think that's encouraging to all the believers out there that aren't necessarily digging into this stuff on the daily, that even those who are seeing a very consistent message here, and that's encouraging.
Yeah, and it's interesting too how we see in your work and work like it. It's almost as if there was, like you mentioned, a common source for certain things, whether it be language or, we can even delve into the spiritual realm and things like that. Do you think that there is, like you're referencing with the source of language that's made it so far and so distant across the globe geographically, referring to this REPHAIMic control mechanism, that really does, the fact that it refers to sort of a totalitarian, autocratic, God King type ruler, it almost, what is the way to put it? It's like, it's almost trying to return, like it came from one source, spread throughout with a desire to unite, has too much of a positive type of feel to it, but to reconglomerate in the same way that an autocratic or totalitarian godlike leader would want to do.
Sure. Well,
it's almost like a boomerang of language that we're seeing.
Yeah, and isn't that that's the ultimate modus operandi of the Antichrist,
right?
In the New Testament. So there's another element of the days of Noah, present in our very complex eschatology.
Yeah, and even referring, like you mentioned, with the Antichrist and the returning to a one world religion, a one world economy, a one world thing, and even with the spreading of globalization and the attempts of our leaders to conglomerate power and to get rid of borders and be a citizen of the world type of thing. It is just an interesting arc when you look at the arc of history spanning all the way from ancient times, whether it's the Tower of Babel or antediluvian times, to try to reconstruct that original structure or organizing for the purposes of returning to that type of human civilization under one ruler. It's just so interesting how it's trying so hard to repeat itself and presenting that possibility as a positive, but not just a positive, but like the ultimate good that could happen right now.
Which in fact it is the exact opposite.
It's tricky like that, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there's that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Right.
That you could sort of you could think of even the indoctrination that goes into reinforcing that cognitive dissonance could be considered kind of magic.
Yeah,
that's
totally.
Yeah,
and it's also got of course echoes of order out of chaos, and and not just the, like you said, civil religion of order out of chaos, but also, I mean, the literal occult themes.
Yeah.
Wow, so fascinating. Well, I think this is a very important, it can certainly get kind of heady, but I think it's definitely an important aspect of consideration when it comes, especially like you said, with a biblical supernatural worldview, and in certain internet communities and things like that, where talking about conspiracy theories and the New World Order and things like that are common, especially as things get crazier and crazier in the world. Sounds like very foundational and important academic work to give, I would say, a deeper understanding to that arc, rather than, basing the whole, your whole understanding on Q posts or something, something like that.
That's part of the reason that I'm bypassing the academic journal and making this available for people.
Yeah. This is awesome. Gons, do you have something you want to go to?
I mean, just to mention, I was going to respond to what you were saying there, Basil. Just this notion, because part of the talk there with a lot of people on the internet about the down with the New World Order, and we're certainly a part of that discussion, but well, we have to. The context is a little different, I think, for us who follow Christ, and we try to, preach the gospel within all that, because this notion of like down with the New World Order, down with the one world government, yes, under this current condition, but once there is this world leader that unites the world, as you talked about there, this Antichrist man of sin figure that basically brings the world under its rule, only then does Jesus return to reclaim his throne. So it's kind of like, okay, yeah, down with the New World Order, this one world system, as it is now being driven by the Antichrist spirit, which has been around forever. But ultimately, that is the reason why it appeals and has so many people fooled, is because the idea, like the ideological sense of a humanity united under one rulership, it appeals because it's sort of the way I think we were designed. It's programmed. Yeah. It is
right,
because we were sort of created that way.
Yeah, we were created that way, but to be under the rule of the sovereign of the universe, not this mockery of perfect unity.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I feel like this discussion is so important when you're talking about that arc, and you're talking about these linguistic connections, because it's another example that demonstrates like what we're dealing with here. That when we say the word king and ruler, what it means to a believer ultimately, and through the whole eschatological arc from beginning to end is one thing, but if you're going to use it in the context of the here and now, like in the moment, you can get lost in the misdirection that seems to have been placed, that you seem to have identified here, connecting back to the Rephaim, which is just so. It's funny because now that you say it and you're examining it and you're going to lay it out academically and everything, it's just so obvious, It's just like, of course, it goes back to the Rephaim. Who else, But
well, also, it's like I've told. I was on Joe Taylor's show this morning, Forbidden Paleontology. He's asking me about evidences, and like a lot of this material that relates to the Watchers and the Giants, the evidence is kind of hiding in plain sight.
Right.
And you have to put together the sort of meta picture.
Right.
And you assemble your your data points, and you look for a pattern. And this is the pattern that's emerging for me in this particular project.
Very cool.
Also, Mockery of Perfect Unity is a great band name.
It's not copyrighted, so
TM. That's his new thing. Just call TM, and for some mysterious reason,
just copyright things just by declaring it.
That's your use of linguistic engineering right there, Basil. Just say TM and you stake claims legally.
Trademark.
There you go.
So, I really want to make sure everybody gets a chance to know where to find your work. But before we start landing this plane, is there something we missed? Is there a good question we didn't ask?
None that I can think of off the top of my head. I think that the conversation has been such that even if you don't have to be a linguist to see these similarities.
Yeah.
And just in the cursory list that I have in the paper, which goes into greater detail about these things and the connections that I'm talking about. I think between the three of us, we've been able to convey the central idea of this hypothesis that I'm putting forward about the origin of this particular cognate and word, and
so you're
why.
Saying we nailed it.
More, you nailed it, and more so, why it's important, why it should be important to believers. Why should we care about the words that we use for king or other language groups? Well, if there's evidence of this cultural engineering, this malicious tampering, then it speaks to the behavior that we're already familiar with, that we associate with the demonic realm, and that should be on the minds of every believer.
Amen. I agree.
Yeah, this just came to my mind too, like the story of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing to the king's orders. I mean, even that seems to have its own sort of, perhaps within it, a rejection of the idea of King Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar is an interesting figure anyway. His as a kind of footnote to that, his name, it comes from the god Nebo, or Nabu, one of the deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon that Mount Nebo is named after in the Transjordan. The mountain that God takes Moses up onto to look at the Promised Land. Well, there's a passage in Daniel where he's writing about Nebuchadnezzar brought treasures from his god's city. Well, the town that was most associated, city that was most associated with the god Nebo at that time was in northern Mesopotamia, and would have been, interestingly enough, would have been part of this, the southern fringe of this, where the Proto-Semitic region touched the southern end of this Indo-European heartland. It's kind of an interesting footnote to what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, it all seems to connect.
Yeah. Well, I recommend everybody get into this work and explore what you have here, because not only, I think, do the specifics of your theory here have quite an import on understanding the world as it is, but I feel like there's some very important learning in how to think, ways of looking and exploring things that we might take for granted, like language and its origins and connections therein, that I think would be very beneficial to have a good foundation, not just again, in this very fascinating theory, and one that I see a lot of weight coming from, but also to be able to take the same theory and learn how to think about perhaps other words or other ways language have control over us that we might take for granted or not know about. So I highly recommend that. What's the best way for people to get your work here?
Well, this report in particular, I think I sent you guys a link to, but you can I'll put a link on my website too, on Burton Beyond, and people can go to the site, and just for a modest fee, people can download the report. I'm
looking at it here. I think you got it for $3.99. Very affordable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm on Facebook and Twitter. People can find. Well, I'll put links up to it there as well, and I'll put one on the Institute website as well.
Awesome. So
if you want to take a deeper dive into subjects like this, I actually offer a certification in biblical anthropology through the Institute, and it's on sale this week for $150.
Oh my gosh. Awesome. So the best way to find your stuff is going to Burton Beyond. That would be a first step.
Mm-hmm.
You got any other websites that people can make sure to bookmark?
Yeah, the Institute website is tioba.org. That's the Institute of Biblical Anthropology.
Ah, awesome. Okay.
People can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, on YouTube at Burton Beyond. Always putting up new content. So.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good. We'll put that in the chat. We'll make sure to put all that in the show notes, and make sure to follow on your social media, everybody. This is some deep, important scholarly ways of thinking that I think we all need to make sure to introduce into our own research and our own critical thinking as we figure out what's going on in this crazy world of ours. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burton. This has been a real pleasure. And like we mentioned before, I think we're going to have to make sure to not wait 50 episodes to get you back on.
Absolutely. Yeah. Had a blast.
Good. Awesome. Gons, any last words before we land this plane here?
No, I just want to thank Dr. Burton, and not just 50 episodes, but 6 years between episodes. So let's try to lessen that window there and have you back on much sooner.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Canary Cry Radio. Make sure to check out Dr. Judd Burton and his report, The War of Words, God, Kings, and Their Titles, a preliminary report on the linguistic relationship between the Rephaim and royal titles in Eurasian languages. Very important. Make sure to tune in to the next Canary Cry Radio. But until then, think outside the cage.